I want to finish up this lecture by differentiating neurons according to their more specialized functions. All the neurons that we're going to talk about have the same mechanism of gathering information, summing that information, and then passing that information through action potentials. But there are three general specialized functional forms of neurons. One form is a motor neuron. Motor neurons synapse onto muscle tissue. They get their input from other neurons, and then they translate that into messages that they give to muscle tissue. So motor neurons translate our neural activity into muscular movement, and they do this by releasing neurotransmitters into muscle fibers. The release of neurotransmitters binds to muscle cell receptors, triggering sodium influx and potassium efflux, which result in the case of muscles, muscle contraction. Now, interestingly, vertebrate motor neurons only cause muscle contraction. Hence, vertebrates need to get massages and things like that. Invertebrates, however, invertebrate motor neurons can cause both contraction and relaxation. So here we have a specialized function still using action potentials, taking information from neurons, translating it into muscle contraction or movement. Of course, we have sensory neurons, and sensory neurons collect or transduce the input they receive from various forms of physical stimuli. They are the way in which information gets from the world into our nervous system. We're already familiar with rods and cones. Their physical stimulus is, of course, light. But sensory neurons come in several varieties, including touch and sound neurons that are triggered by mechanical and chemical actions, taste and smell neurons that are triggered by chemical binding, and visual receptors that are triggered by photonic energy. So here's an example of a different kind of neuron that we haven't really talked about before, sensory neuron. The olfactory neuron has receptors on its dendritic spine or cilia that project into the mucus covering of the olfactory epithelium, the skin. And these receptors bind to a small number of different odor molecules for which they have an affinity. When an odor molecule binds to the dendritic receptor, it causes sodium and calcium influx, which causes an action potential. And that's how they transduce these molecular molecules, their presence, into information that gets transmitted into the nervous system. So mouse olfactory neurons that are pictured in this picture below here, they are being stained here. They have the same receptor protein. The cilia are on the left-hand side in the epithelium there in the mucus lining. The axons are on the right, projecting towards the same cells in the olfactory bulb. By far, the largest population of neurons are interneurons. Interneurons come in many forms, all of which facilitate neuron-to-neuron communication. Interneurons receive input from other neurons, which they process and then transmit to other neurons. So, for example, ganglion cells with centers around receptive fields are an example of an interneuron, the processing or communicative function of which we discussed when we talked about vision. Center surround cells use input from rods and cones to extract feature information, which they then pass on to cells in the lateral geniculate nucleus. We can see the relative roles, functional specializations of sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons when we look at this now familiar model of the reflex arc in the dorsal horn of the spine. All right? We have our sensory neurons. In this case, We have nociceptor being triggered by pressure, transmitting its transduced information about the surface of our skin to an interneuron inside our dorsal horn. That interneuron takes that information from our sensory neurons here, and it computes a threshold function trying to decide if this is a severe situation, a situation that warrants immediate removal. And if it passes that threshold, it then sends information to our motor neuron. That motor neuron transmits that information to the relevant muscles. It releases its neurotransmitter, causing contraction, hence causing you to pull your hand away. There are about 100 billion neurons inside every human skull, that is in the brain. And there are, of course, other neurons throughout the body, in the spine, in the skin, in the stomach, and so on. So they all function in the same general way, and they have subspecialities for particular kinds of specialized information gathering or processing.